People like you don't read, you memorize menus, the billionaire said, his voice cutting clean through the soft jazz and clinking glasses like a blade against crystal, and just like that, the entire $5,000 a plate dining room went still, conversations folding into silence as heads slowly turned, because moments like this didn't belong in places like this. Not under warm amber lights and skyline views stretching across Manhattan. Not where power dressed in tailored suits and spoke in quiet confidence. But Ethan Caldwell had never been a man who cared about where a line should be drawn, only how far he could push it. And tonight, he pushed it straight at Naomi, who stood beside the table in a pressed black uniform, a tray balanced lightly in one hand, her posture calm, her face unreadable, the kind of calm that didn't come from weakness but from something far more dangerous, something no one in that room had bothered to look for, because to them, she was background, invisible, replaceable, just another black waitress moving between tables, refilling glasses no one remembered emptying. But Ethan saw an audience, and he smiled slightly, leaning back in his chair as if the entire room were his stage. Tell me, he continued, louder now, do you even understand what we're saying, or do you just nod and hope for tips? A few guests chuckled, not because it was funny, but because laughter was easier than discomfort, easier than stepping in, easier than acknowledging that. Something had shifted in the air. Naomi didn't respond. Not immediately. She simply placed the wine glass down with precise control, her fingers steady, her movements measured, and for a brief second, her eyes lifted, meeting Ethan's gaze in a way that didn't ask for permission, didn't seek approval, just observed. And that was the first crack, small, almost invisible, but real, because Ethan wasn't used to being looked at like that, not by someone he had already decided didn't matter. He leaned forward slightly, amused, intrigued now. I'll make it simple, he said, switching without warning into rapid Japanese, his tone sharp, deliberate, a test disguised as entertainment. Understand this, and I'll give you $10,000. The number hung in the air like bait, and now more phones appeared, subtle at first, then obvious, because people sensed it, the shift, the possibility that this wasn't going to end the way he expected. Naomi stood still for half a breath, then another, the room tightening around her silence. And then she spoke. Not loudly, not dramatically, just clearly, her voice smooth and precise as she answered him in fluent Japanese, each word placed exactly where it belonged. And before the shock could even settle, she tilted her head slightly and corrected his phrasing, gently, accurately, without hesitation. And that was when the room truly froze, because this wasn't part of the script. This wasn't how these stories went, and Ethan's smile didn't disappear all at once. It faded, slowly, like something slipping out of his control, and Naomi wasn't done. Not yet, because what no one in that room understood, what no one had ever bothered to ask, was how a woman they dismissed in seconds had spent years learning in silence. And as she shifted effortlessly into French, then Spanish, the air itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting, because something bigger than a conversation was unfolding, something that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with being seen. And for the first time that night, Ethan Caldwell wasn't the one in control of the room. The silence did not break. It deepened, stretching across the table like something alive, something watching, because now every eye in that room was no longer on Ethan Caldwell, but on Naomi, the woman they had not noticed 5 minutes ago. The woman who now stood at the center of something none of them could explain, and Ethan felt it, that shift, that quiet transfer of gravity. So he leaned back again, slower this time, forcing a smile that no longer reached his eyes. Interesting, he said. His voice measured, controlled, but thinner now. You memorized a few phrases, congratulations. A few weak chuckles followed, but they died quickly because no one was sure anymore which side they were on. And Naomi did not react to his words. She did not defend herself, did not argue. She simply adjusted the edge of the table setting, aligning a fork by less than half an inch. A small movement, almost invisible, but precise, intentional, the kind of detail that came from discipline, not accident. And when she spoke again, her voice remained calm, steady, untouched by the tension in the room. It was not memorization, she said, switching seamlessly into Italian, her pronunciation clean, her tone effortless, then into German, each sentence structured with care, then into Mandarin, her cadence natural, unforced, as if each language lived in her rather than sat on the surface, and with every transition, something inside the room shifted further, something uncomfortable, something undeniable, because this was no longer a coincidence, no longer a trick, this was mastery. And mastery demanded recognition whether people wanted to give it or not. Ethan's fingers tapped lightly against the table, a habit he had when recalculating, when something did not fit the model in his head. And for the first time that night, Naomi did not feel like a variable he could control. She felt like a problem he had underestimated, and that realization unsettled him more than he would ever admit. Then explain this, he said, quickly now, moving into French, faster than before, sharper, trying to regain ground. But Naomi responded before he even finished, correcting a verb. Tense mid-sentence, gently, almost respectfully, but undeniably. And that was when the last trace of laughter disappeared completely, because correction implied authority, and authority was not supposed to belong to her. Not in this room, not in this world they had built. And yet here she was, holding it without raising her voice, without asking for permission, just existing in it. And somewhere near the back, someone lowered their phone slowly, no longer recording for entertainment, but for evidence, because this was no longer a spectacle. This was a reversal, and reversals change things. Naomi paused then, just for a second, letting the silence return, letting it settle, letting it do what silence does best when truth enters a room. It forces people to face it. And when she finally spoke again, she did not switch languages this time. She chose English, clear, direct, unshaken. Would you like me to continue? She asked, not as a challenge, not as a threat, but as a simple question. And that was the moment Ethan Caldwell realized something he had never had to consider before. That control was not always taken by force. Sometimes it was taken by presence, by precision, by knowing exactly when to speak and when to let the room speak for you. And as he looked around, at the faces that were no longer laughing with him, at the attention that was no longer his, he understood, quietly, unwillingly, that the narrative he had started was no longer his to finish. No one spoke, not because they did not have words, but because none of their words seemed safe anymore. And in that silence, something far more revealing than noise began to surface, the quiet truth that the room had been wrong, not just about Naomi, but about what mattered, and Ethan Caldwell felt it tightening around him, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable, like a shift in air pressure before a storm. He straightened slightly, adjusting his cuff as if that small movement could restore something that had already slipped. You are impressive, he said finally, choosing each word with care, slower now, measured. But let us not pretend this changes anything. His tone was controlled, almost calm, but underneath it, there was something new, something unfamiliar, and Naomi heard it, not in what he said, but in what he was trying not to show. And still, she did not rush to respond. She allowed the moment to breathe, allowed his words to settle in the space between them, because she understood something he did not. That timing was power, and power did not always belong to the one who spoke first. When she finally moved, it was subtle, a small step forward, just enough to be seen without asking to be seen. Her voice when it came was steady, grounded, the kind of voice that carried because it did not need to rise. It already changed something, she said, simply, and for a second, Ethan did not answer, because he knew she was right, even if he would never say it out loud. And around them, the room had begun to rearrange itself, not physically, but socially. Attention had shifted, alliances had shifted, the quiet hierarchy that once placed him at the center had cracked, and in its place was uncertainty, curiosity, and something else, respect, not loud, not declared, but present. And that presence unsettled him more than any challenge ever had, because this was not a negotiation he could win with numbers or leverage. This was something else entirely, something human, something he had spent years learning to overlook. Naomi glanced briefly at the table, at the untouched plates, the half-filled glasses, the expensive setting that suddenly felt smaller than it had minutes ago, then back at Ethan, her expression unchanged, not proud, not angry, just clear. You asked if I understood, she continued, her tone even. But you never asked how I learned. And that question, simple as it was, landed heavier than anything else that had been said that night, because it pointed to something deeper, something no one in that room had considered, not once, not ever. And for the first time, someone at the far end of the table leaned forward, listening, not to Ethan, but to her, waiting, and Naomi did not rush. She did not turn it into a speech. She gave them pieces, just enough. My mother worked 2 jobs, she said. She translated hospital forms for people who could not read them. And I watched, I listened, I learned. Her eyes did not leave Ethan's, not as a challenge, but as a statement. I learned because I had to, not because anyone expected me to. And that distinction hung in the air, sharp, undeniable, because expectation had always been on his side, handed to him, assumed for him, while hers had been the opposite. And now, those 2 realities stood face to face, and only one of them had needed to fight to exist. The room remained silent, but it was no longer the same silence. It was heavier, more aware, and somewhere deep in that awareness was the beginning of something Ethan Caldwell had never truly experienced before. Not fear, not exactly, but the realization that for once, the person he had dismissed knew something he did not, and worse, had earned it in ways he never had. The room did not return to normal, because something irreversible had already taken place, something that could not be undone by a smile or a shift in tone, and Ethan Caldwell knew it. Even if he refused to fully accept it, his posture remained composed, but the certainty that once defined him had thinned, replaced by calculation, by the quiet effort of a man trying to regain ground he had never lost before. You learned out of necessity, he said, carefully, as if framing her story into something smaller might make it easier to control. That is admirable. The words sounded polished, almost generous, but it carried distance, a subtle attempt to place her back into a category he understood, one where he still stood above, and for a brief moment, it almost worked, because admiration can sometimes sound like respect, and respect can sometimes hide dismissal. But Naomi did not move, did not soften. She simply held his gaze, steady, unshaken, and when she spoke again, her voice carried something new, not louder, but clearer, sharper in its intent. It was not necessity alone, she said. It was expectation, and that word shifted the air again, because expectation, when spoken by someone like her, did not mean what it meant for him. For Ethan, expectation had always been external, handed to him by investors, by markets, by a world that assumed his success before he proved it. But for Naomi, expectation had been internal, built quietly, piece by piece, in spaces no one applauded, in moments no one witnessed, and she continued, not as a speech, but as a truth that no longer needed permission to exist. When you grow up translating for people who are ignored, you learn quickly that understanding is not about language, it is about being heard. Her words did not rush, they landed, one after another, deliberate, grounded, and around them. The room listened in a way it had not listened before, not passively, but actively, as if something inside each person had been called forward. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, a subtle reaction, almost invisible, but real, because this was no longer about proving intelligence. That part had already been settled. This was about something else, something deeper, something he had spent years building his world to avoid. And he leaned forward again, slower this time, his voice quieter, less performative. And what exactly are you trying to prove? He asked, and for the first time that night, it was not a challenge, it was a question, and that distinction mattered. Naomi did not answer immediately. She let the question exist, let it breathe, because some questions reveal more in their asking than in their answer. Then she shook her head slightly, almost gently. Nothing, she said. I am not trying to prove anything. And that answer unsettled him more than any argument could have, because it removed the framework he relied on. There was no competition, no negotiation, no measurable outcome, just truth. And truth did not operate by his rules. She took a small step back then, not retreating, but resetting the space between them, reclaiming her role without losing what she had established. You made an assumption. She continued, her tone even. And now you have more information. Simple, direct, undeniable. And that was when the final shift happened, quiet but complete, because the room no longer saw her as a participant in his narrative. They saw her as the one who had rewritten it, and Ethan Caldwell, for the first time in a very long time, had no immediate response, not because he lacked intelligence, but because he had just encountered something his intelligence alone could not solve. The silence did not rush to fill itself. It lingered, heavy and deliberate, as if the room itself needed time to understand what had just happened. Because this was no longer about a waitress and a billionaire. This was about something far more unsettling. The collapse of a certainty everyone in that room had quietly agreed upon, and Ethan Caldwell felt it in the way no one moved to rescue him. No one laughed. No one redirected the conversation. They simply watched, and being watched like that, without control, without narrative, was unfamiliar territory for a man who had built his life on commanding attention. He exhaled slowly, a controlled breath, then reached for his glass, not to drink, but to create a pause, to buy himself a second, because seconds mattered when you were recalibrating, when you were deciding whether to push forward or step back. And for the first time that night, stepping back began to look like the stronger move. He placed the glass down carefully, aligning it with the edge of the table as if precision could restore order. "You are right," he said finally, the words quiet but clear, and that alone shifted something again, because acknowledgement, especially from someone like him, did not come easily. It was not his instinct, it was a decision, and decisions revealed more than reactions ever could. Naomi did not respond immediately, not because she was surprised, but because she understood the weight of that moment. Acknowledgement was not an apology, but it was a door, and doors, once opened, changed the direction of a room. Ethan continued, his voice steadier now, less sharp, less performative. "I made an assumption," he said, not looking away this time, not deflecting, just stating it. And for a brief second, the room seemed to release a breath it had been holding, because this was not the ending they had expected. Not the clean victory, not the dramatic collapse, but something quieter, something more complicated, and Naomi saw it too. The shift from dominance to awareness, from certainty to reflection, and she nodded once, small, almost imperceptible, not as approval, but as recognition, because acknowledgement did not erase what had been said, it did not undo the moment, but it marked the beginning of something else, something more honest, and Ethan leaned back slightly, his posture no longer rigid, no longer trying to project control, but settling into something closer to presence. "You said understanding is about being heard," he added, his tone thoughtful now, as if he were repeating her words not to challenge them, but to consider them, and that was new. That willingness to consider rather than dominate, and Naomi answered simply, "Yes." No elaboration, no performance, just truth. And that simplicity carried more weight than any speech could have, because it left no room for misinterpretation, no space to twist meaning into something more comfortable. The room remained quiet, but it was no longer tense, it was attentive. And somewhere at the far end of the table, someone straightened in their chair. Another guest lowered their phone completely. The energy had shifted from spectacle to reflection, from entertainment to something closer to respect, and Ethan noticed it, not just in how they looked at her, but in how they no longer looked at him the same way, not with fear, not with automatic agreement, but with something more measured, more human, and that realization settled in slowly, not as a loss, but as a recalibration, because power, he was beginning to understand, was not just about control, it was about how you were seen when control slipped away, and in that moment, as the skyline lights flickered beyond the glass and the city moved on without noticing any of it, Ethan Caldwell understood something that had never appeared on any balance sheet, that presence, real presence, could not be bought, could not be forced, it had to be earned, and the woman standing in front of him, the one he had dismissed minutes ago, had just shown him exactly what that looked like. The moment did not end. It evolved, stretching into something quieter, deeper, as if the room itself had shifted from watching a scene to witnessing a truth, and Naomi felt it in the way. The air no longer pressed against her, no longer tested her, but held space instead, and she stepped back slightly, not retreating, just returning to where she stood before all of this began, her posture composed, her presence unchanged, as if nothing extraordinary had happened, because to her, it had not. It was simply who she was, and that, more than anything, unsettled Ethan Caldwell. Because he had spent his entire life building moments, controlling outcomes, shaping perception, and here was someone who did not perform, did not seek validation, did not need the room to confirm her worth. She simply existed in it. And that kind of certainty could not be negotiated, could not be bought. It could only be recognized. Ethan watched her for a second longer than necessary, not with judgment now, but with something closer to curiosity, as if trying to understand a language he had never needed to learn. How many? He asked finally, his voice quieter than before, almost thoughtful. How many languages do you actually speak? The question was different, not a test, not a trap, just a question, and that difference did not go unnoticed. Naomi adjusted the edge of her sleeve slightly, a small grounding motion, then answered. 6. Simple, direct, no embellishment. And that answer carried weight, not because of the number itself, but because of how easily she said it, as if it were not extraordinary, as if it were just another part of her day. And Ethan nodded once, slowly, absorbing it, recalculating again. But this time not for control, for understanding. And you learned all of them on your own? He asked, and Naomi paused for a brief second, not because she did not know the answer, but because she chose her words carefully. I learned because I needed to understand people, she said, and that answer landed differently than any statistic ever could, because it was not about skill. It was about purpose, and purpose could not be dismissed as easily as talent. The room remained quiet, but it was no longer the silence of tension. It was the silence of attention, of people leaning in without moving, listening without interrupting, and somewhere near the center of the table, one of the investors who had been silent all night finally spoke, not loudly, not to interrupt, but to acknowledge. That is rare, he said, almost to himself, and Naomi did not react, because she had never needed the word rare to define her. She had lived too long without being seen to now measure herself by how others described her, and Ethan noticed that too, the absence of reaction, the absence of performance, and it forced something inside him to shift again, because he realized, slowly, that this was not a moment she would carry as a victory. It was a moment he would carry as a lesson, and that difference mattered. He leaned back, slightly, his posture no longer rigid, no longer defensive, just present, and for the first time that night, he allowed the room to exist without trying to control it, allowed the conversation to breathe without steering it, and in that space, something unexpected began to form, not an agreement, not a resolution, but a recognition, quiet, mutual, and grounded in something neither of them had named yet. And as Naomi reached for the tray again, lifting it with the same steady hands, the same measured grace, it became clear to everyone watching that she had not stepped into his world that night. He had stepped, briefly, into hers, and in doing so, he had seen something he could not unsee, something that would follow him long after the lights dimmed and the room emptied. Because some lessons do not announce themselves. They settle, they stay, and they change you whether you are ready or not. The room slowly began to breathe again, but it did not return to what it had been, because something invisible had shifted, something deeper than conversation, and as Naomi moved between the tables once more, carrying her tray with the same quiet precision, it became clear that the balance of the room had changed, not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently. People who had once avoided eye contact now followed her with their eyes, not out of curiosity, but out of recognition, and recognition, once given, could not be taken back. Ethan Caldwell remained seated for a moment longer than expected, watching her as she resumed her role without hesitation, without pride, without lingering in the attention she had earned, and that was what unsettled him most. Not her intelligence, not her composure, but her indifference to the validation he had always assumed people wanted, because he understood validation. He had built an empire on it, but this was something else entirely, something internal, something grounded, and as he stood up slowly, adjusting his jacket out of habit rather than necessity, he realized that the room was no longer waiting for him to lead it. The conversation had already moved beyond him. Guests were speaking in lower tones now, not about deals or numbers, but about what they had just witnessed, and in those conversations, his name was no longer the center, Naomi's was, and that shift, subtle as it was, carried weight, because influence, real influence, did not announce itself, it revealed itself in moments like this, Ethan took a step forward, then paused, as if deciding whether to leave the moment as it was or to step back into it. And for a second, it was not the billionaire deciding. It was the man, and the difference between the two had never been clearer. He turned toward her just as she finished setting a glass at another table, her movements unchanged, her focus steady, as if nothing about her night had been interrupted. "Naomi," he said, not loudly, but enough for her to hear. And when she turned, there was no hesitation, no surprise, just attention, the same steady presence she had held from the beginning. And he held her gaze for a brief moment, not searching for control this time, but for understanding. "I was wrong," he said, the words simple, direct, stripped of performance, and that mattered. Because simplicity, when it came from someone like him, was not easy. It required the removal of layers he had spent years building. The room did not react immediately, but the weight of those words settled quickly, because acknowledgement, when spoken clearly, carried further than any apology disguised in language. Naomi nodded once, not to accept it, not to validate it, but to recognize it, and that distinction remained, because she was not there to receive his correction. She was there because she had always belonged there, whether anyone saw it or not, and Ethan understood that now, not fully, not completely, but enough to know that this moment was not his to define. It never had been, and as he stepped back slightly, giving space instead of taking it, the final shift completed itself, quiet and undeniable, because the room no longer saw a hierarchy. It saw something else, something closer to balance, and in that balance, something rare existed, respect, not given by title, not assumed by wealth, but earned in a moment when it mattered most. And as Naomi turned back to her work, her focus returning to the rhythm she knew so well, it became clear that the story did not belong to the man who had spoken first. It belonged to the woman who had chosen when to answer, and that difference would be remembered long after the night itself had ended. The night did not end when the conversation did. It lingered, stretching beyond the table, beyond the soft glow of the chandelier lights and the skyline that shimmered against the glass walls, because moments like this did not belong to a single room. They traveled, they settled into memory, and they followed people home. And as the dinner slowly resumed, forks lifted again, glasses clinked once more, but the rhythm had changed, quieter now, more aware, as if everyone had been reminded of something they had forgotten, or perhaps something they had chosen not to see. Naomi continued her work with the same steady pace, moving from table to table, her presence no longer invisible but no less grounded, and the difference was subtle but undeniable. People looked at her differently now, not with surprise, not with curiosity, but with intention, as if acknowledging her without needing to say it out loud. And she did not respond to those looks, not because she did not notice, but because she did not need them. Her focus remained where it had always been, in the work, in the moment, in the quiet discipline that had carried her this far. And across the room, Ethan Caldwell stood near the window, his reflection faint against the city lights, his posture relaxed but his expression thoughtful, not distracted, not restless, just present in a way that felt unfamiliar. He was not checking his phone, not directing his assistant, not recalculating numbers in his head. He was thinking, and thinking, for a man like him, was rarely about reflection. But tonight was different. Tonight, the variables had changed, and for once, he was not trying to solve them. He was trying to understand them. He glanced back toward the room, toward Naomi, who was now speaking softly with another guest, her tone calm, her movements measured, exactly as they had been before, and yet everything about how he saw her had shifted, not because she had changed, but because he had, and that realization settled slowly, not as a revelation, but as a quiet correction. And nearby, two investors who had arrived earlier with sharp opinions and sharper expectations now spoke in hushed tones. Their conversation no longer centered on profit margins or acquisition strategies, but on something less tangible, something harder to quantify. "Did you see how she corrected him?" One whispered, not with disbelief, but with respect, and the other nodded, not adding to it, because some moments did not need commentary. They spoke for themselves, and that was what this had become. Not a story about a mistake, not a story about embarrassment, but a story about recognition, the kind that did not come easily and did not leave once it arrived. and as the evening moved forward, that recognition spread quietly, table by table, glance by glance, until it became part of the atmosphere itself, something unspoken but understood, and Naomi, at the center of it without trying to be, continued as she always had, grounded, focused, unaffected by the shift that everyone else felt so clearly. And that was the final piece, the part no one could quite explain. Because in a room built on performance, on status, on the constant need to be seen, she was the only one who did not perform, and in not performing, she had become the most visible person there. And as the lights dimmed slightly and the evening edged closer to its end, one truth remained, quiet but undeniable, that what had happened in that room was not about language, not about wealth, not even about power. It was about presence, the kind that could not be taught in boardrooms or bought in billion-dollar deals, the kind that was built quietly, over time, in moments no one applauded. And as Ethan turned back to the window, the city stretching endlessly before him, he understood, perhaps for the first time, that some of the most valuable things in the world were the ones no one thought to measure. And that realization did not fade. It stayed, lingering long after the night itself began to close. The night moved toward its quiet close, but the weight of it did not fade. It settled, like something placed carefully into memory, something that would not be forgotten even when the lights dimmed and the tables were cleared. And as the last courses were served and the low hum of conversation softened into something more reflective, Naomi continued her work with the same steady rhythm, her steps measured, her focus unchanged, as if the moment that had shifted the entire room had simply passed through her without leaving a mark. But that was not because it meant nothing. It was because she had never needed it to mean everything. And across the room, Ethan Caldwell remained by the window a moment longer, watching the reflection of a city that never paused, a city built on movement, on ambition, on the belief that power could be accumulated and measured. And yet tonight had shown him something different, something quieter, something that did not fit into numbers or contracts. And as he turned back toward the room, his gaze found Naomi again, not because she demanded attention, but because she held it without asking, and that difference stayed with him, not as discomfort anymore, but as understanding, slow, incomplete, but real. He took a step forward, then another, not with urgency, not with purpose to reclaim anything, but simply to close the distance. And when he reached her, she was adjusting a place setting, aligning the details no one else noticed, the kind of work that rarely earned recognition but always required care. "Naomi," he said again, his voice even, grounded, and when she looked up, there was no tension left. In the moment, only presence, and he paused briefly, not searching for the right words, but choosing them with intention. "You did not need this room to see you," he said, and it was not a question, not a statement of admiration, but an acknowledgement, simple and direct. And Naomi held his gaze for a second, then answered just as simply, "No." And that was all. No elaboration, no explanation, because none was needed. And in that exchange, something settled completely, something that had been shifting all night finally found its place, not as a victory for either of them, but as a truth they both now understood, that recognition, real recognition, does not come from being noticed, it comes from being known. And as Ethan nodded once, quietly, he stepped back, not out of defeat, but out of respect, a gesture small in movement, but significant in meaning. And around them, the room continued its slow return to normal, but it was not the same normal. It carried something new, something subtle but lasting, a recalibration of how people saw, how they listened, how they understood the space between power and presence. And as Naomi lifted her tray once more, moving toward the next table, the rhythm of her steps steady, unchanged, it became clear that the story did not end with what had been said. It continued in what had been learned, in the quiet shifts that would follow each person out of that room and into whatever came next. And as the lights softened further and the city outside carried on without pause, one truth remained, clear and unshaken, that power can fill a room, but presence can change it. And that night, without raising her voice, without asking for attention, she had done exactly that.